Exaggerating, but I wasn't. Couldn't make that up. So now I'm going to introduce our guest speakers. Patrisse Cullors is an artist, organizer, and freedom fighter. She's the co-founder of Black Lives Matter and a board member of Dignity and Power Now, and she's also a performance artist. Jasleen Coley is the director of the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA School of Law. She's practiced law in the areas of civil rights, labor law, and policy development. And please join me in welcoming Patrisse Cullors and Jasleen Coley.
We didn't, yeah, the mics are hot.
All right. Okay, it's on. Um, First of all, I just want to thank the Hammer for having us here today. I know that this is part of a series that the Hammer's been doing on the 25th anniversary of the LA uprising, and the Hammer's really just done a wonderful job of putting on a series of incredibly thoughtful, incredibly informative, and enlightening events. And I know before that, the Hammer also did a series around Say Her Name, and around other issues concerning Black women. And I just really want to thank the Hammer and Claudia, who have put on these really, really incredibly important conversations. This is a really important service that you do for the community by bringing us all here together to have these talks. And I also want to thank the filmmakers for allowing us to screen Do Not Resist, which was just an excellent exploration of the many ways militarization has infiltrated domestic policing. And I'm looking forward to having a deeper conversation with Patrisse about these issues. But before we go into a deeper dive there, I just want to back up for a minute. So as Claudia mentioned, I direct the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA School of Law. And I came upon critical race theory early in my law school career. During my first year of law school, I remember being incredibly frustrated by the way the law was taught. It was really taught in this way that seemed almost void of any social, historical, political context. And we would talk about law and policy as though these were abstract issues and ways to flex our rhetorical skills. And it was incredibly, incredibly frustrating because we all know that the law has very real, very visceral impacts on people. And those impacts can be brutal and sometimes fatal, especially on marginalized communities, especially communities of color, LGBTQ communities, low-income communities, et cetera. Sorry, I should have planned that a bit better. And remember that stapling doesn't actually go with a clipboard. So one of the central tenets of critical race theory is centers around the power of narrative, both thinking about which narratives are privileged and told and which ones are silenced, as well as the very deliberate act of telling marginalized narratives. And today I've been thinking about two really important narratives. As we've just mentioned, as you know, this week does mark the 25th anniversary of the LA uprisings. So the first narrative is that around Rodney King. And what I think is just so incredibly powerful about that story is not that this is the first Black man brutalized by the police, nor is he anywhere near the last. But the dissemination of that video really marked the moment where America, specifically white America, or the America that would not acknowledge racialized policing, could no longer feign ignorance or innocence to this type of racialized violence. And that was the moment when those excuses couldn't even bear a hint of credibility because the country was forced to confront this very real narrative of racialized state violence. And I'm also curious at this moment, also thinking about Patrisse's own narrative. Patrisse is someone who was born and raised in Los Angeles, and as someone who was a young child during the riots, and as someone for whom racialized state violence was never something you could be innocent or ignorant to, even if you had wanted to be. So before we start talking more about the film, I'm curious about your own trajectory. How were you shaped by growing up in Los Angeles? Was the uprising an important moment to you in your own development? Maybe even if not at the time, but perhaps as you look back on it? And what were the experiences that shaped your formation as an organizer? And I know that you often say that you don't like the concept of saying you're a leader of a movement, that this is a very leaderful movement. But as someone who is definitely a very central figure in fighting police violence.
Yeah, thanks. Um, hey, everybody. It's good to see the team. And this film, I think, when Claudia asked me to screen it beforehand, I had a lot of resistance because it is very challenging to witness sort of like continuous trauma on Black communities in particular. And when I did finally screen it, there were these moments where I was like, it brought memories back. The scene where, the first search that we see in the family's windows being knocked out and people are handcuffed and they're sort of like confused and dazed and, there's all this law enforcement, all this military equipment, and you see like the juxtaposition of this family who's clearly poor, and then this government agency that has resourced with a significant amount of money and power and control. And for me, growing up in this city, it has been a really clarifying, there have been a lot of clarifying moments, specifically being in where I grew up in Van Nuys and witnessing the decimation of my community by law enforcement. It's not a hyperbole to me. Literally, my neighborhood was decimated by the police. The community was over-policed, overly incarcerated. And I really believe that those of us who survived, because many of us didn't, but those of us who did survive, I say we survived the war on drugs and the war on gangs. Um, and the last thing I'll say on this is, I think I got home this morning. I was in Tacoma, Washington last night, and I got home this morning, and I got off the flight, and there was, LA airport police, because the airport has its own police too, and they had these assault rifles on, and, they just had all this military equipment, and I just looked around to see like, like, is there anybody's jaw dropped like noticing this? No, there wasn't. We just walk around and we've normalized the ways in which law enforcement is completely militarized. And I think part of uh, what's so significant 25 years later is there is a new crew of voices, largely because of social media, not because of mainstream media. We didn't learn about the militarization of law enforcement through mainstream media. We saw it when the community of Ferguson was under siege, right? We saw it when the community of Oakland was under siege after the Oscar Grant killing. Many of us saw it when we had battery rams shoved through our doors. And so it's not because of mainstream media, it's really because of regular people like us that have said, I'm sorry, why does this agency have tanks and assault rifles? Why is this happening in our communities? We dared to challenge and we dared to ask. And so I think it's really important in this moment that we, even with this, terrible administration, um, with Attorney General Jeff Sessions at the helm of criminalizing and bringing back the war on drugs, and bringing back the Jim Crow era, that we're in a different time. We get to fight differently. We have different tools now. And that actually gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, so this era actually segues to the first question I had about the film. So one of the things I was really struck by is the footage of Ferguson and the militarized police response to the protests that occurred there. And I think that's one of the differences that we see between 25 years ago during the uprisings and today is just this increased militarization, especially in times of civil unrest. And I think it's especially important for us to think about, given what you've just discussed, the new administration and their posturing vis-a-vis social movements, and also the rise of various social movements. So I'm curious what your thoughts are regarding engaging in protest and resistance in this atmosphere of both military-grade equipment and military-style mechanisms of surveillance.
I mean, is the question, do I think we should do it still?
Not so much should we do it, but
What
how
are the
do you think?
consequences?
Well, the consequences um, and perhaps what advice you would give to those engaged in resistance, in resisting smartly and being protective of oneself.
Yeah, I mean, I just like, not to be a Debbie Downer, but like there's no way we could fully protect ourselves. The state is bigger and stronger, has more money, has more resource than we are. But there are ways that we can be more protective of ourselves and our communities. There's a lot of new technology that allows for us to be smarter about how we show up on the internet, about how we interact with folks online, about things you probably shouldn't say online, right? If we think about all the times that something happens and then law enforcement, uses people's social media to build their case. And so it's not about hiding who you are or shaming who you are, but it's about being mindful about what you put up, because it will be used against it. We have, they don't have to create FBI profiles on us because we already made them for them. Um, and that's not a diss or a judgment. That's what comes with the territory in this moment. I think, the other piece is my home's been raided multiple times by LAPD. I've seen drones over my home. Um, and I think for people who aren't sort of engaged in the daily activity of activism, don't realize how much surveillance is happening on a daily basis. But just being aware, um, and not thinking that folks are being conspiracy theorists, right? And being like, oh, actually, this is this is actually happening. I think is really important. There's an amazing organization locally called the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition that I'm a part of, that's led by Hamid Khan, who's done incredible work on challenging our local law enforcement on the use of drones. LAPD has been trying to use drones for a long time, and we've been able to successfully stop them. The Sheriff's Department is trying to use drones. Actually, they were um, caught using drones to surveil the Jordan Downs, and there was a huge outcry against that. And so I think there's both like our individual ability to, sort of stop and um, be more careful around how we're surveilled, but I think there's also a community response to surveillance right now. And then I think the last thing I'll say is some of the first communities to be surveilled are Black communities. We know intimately what surveillance looks like. Probation and parole is surveillance. Right? And because I think sort of there's an idea on who gets surveilled or what is surveillance. Um, but we have to broaden the conversation about surveillance as well, and not sort of get caught in the very narrow idea of what surveillance is. Um, Many, uh, you know, police patrolling neighborhoods, that's every 5 to 10 minutes. That's surveillance. That's surveillance culture. Um, Schools having police on campuses. That's surveillance, and so we have to broaden that conversation as well.
So, speaking of schools having officers on campus, that's one area that the film did not actually delve into, was the militarization of policing within our schools. We know that we've seen increased police presence. We've seen the use of metal detectors, and we've seen just the general criminalization of our youth, especially our youth of color. And one of the most disturbing moments I thought in the film was the man who discussed predictive policing and was discussing how you could calculate the probability of an unborn child committing homicide within the first 18 years of his or her life, and as though this were something we should, you know, be talking about. So I'm curious, what are the ways in which you've seen policing impact our youth and our communities, and what are the ramifications of that? And also, what have you seen as some effective forms of resistance to this policing and criminalization of youth?
Some of the first, work I did around challenging criminalization was challenging truancy tickets that were being given to young people in LAUSD. Essentially, LA School Police and LAPD were issuing daytime curfew tickets to young people being late to school. Some young people ditching as well. But large in part, it was young people who were, you know, either the eldest in their family had to go drop off their sibling first, and were about 15, 20 minutes late. And we were seeing a trend in law enforcement sitting outside of schools preying on children and giving them these $250 tickets. And what we were noticing is that students, because they're students, wouldn't go to court. They're either scared, they would forget, and then those truancy tickets would turn into warrants, and then they would bar the students from being able to get their license once they decide to get their license. So this ripple effect, right, of how the everyday life of Black and brown people, poor people, is criminalized. Um, and we fought that and won successfully. We were able to amend the daytime curfew law. Huge, huge fight. Took 6 years to amend. Um, but what it showed me was how invested this city was in particular in policing young people, and really young people being the market for criminalization. And in the last couple years, we've seen LAUSD, and we've seen Compton Unified be gifted tanks, be gifted assault rifles. And the question becomes, for what? What are you going to use a tank for in a school? What are you going to use an assault rifle for? And as you saw in the film, right, this equipment gets used, and it's supposed to be to fight domestic terror, but what it is, it's actually a war on poor people. And that's a mirror inside of our schools. It's a direct mirror inside of our schools. There's some powerful groups that have been fighting the militarization of the Los Angeles School Police Department and the Sheriff's Department for Compton Unified. YJC, Youth Justice Coalition, is one of them. And you would think, that trying to save children's life is a good argument. But if for folks who, there are activists in the room, I can imagine a lot of you are, but for those of you who aren't, when you sit in these rooms and listen to law enforcement essentially create whole stories about why it'll keep them safer and the students safer to have this equipment, it's pretty disturbing.
I want to turn to thinking about a couple of different intersections that are at play here. I read this really interesting quote that said that the war on drugs is what introduced the militarization of our police, but the war on terror is what accelerated it. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts regarding how this militarization aligns with what the state's interests are locally and abroad, and how this interplays with our foreign policy. And to add another layer, I was also thinking about how this militarization is also implicated in our war against undocumented immigrants. Um, According to the ACLU, Sheriff Joe Arpaio of Maricopa County in Arizona had acquired a machine gun so powerful that it could tear down buildings on multiple city blocks. And his department had 120 assault rifles, 5 armored vehicles, and 10 helicopters. Other departments in Arizona obtained equipment like bomb suits and night vision goggles. So I'm curious how the intersection of the war on drugs, the war on terror, and this war on undocumented immigrants have all kind of aligned in perpetuating this militarization of the police. And what are the different intersections you see, and perhaps also ways in which you see resistance being fought along these various dimensions, and finding ways of collaboration and intersection as well.
Yeah, I mean, there has been an increased militarization of law enforcement since the late 60s. The first SWAT team was created here in Los Angeles. Special Weapons and Tactics. It was actually developed in response to the Panther Party. It was developed in response to the Watts rebellions. And the first crew of people to lead it, and the person who was at the helm of it, was Daryl Gates. Should not be a surprise. Uh, and you know the first time they used the SWAT team? Anybody know first time they used a SWAT team? On Central Ave and 41st. The shootout between the Panther Party and LAPD. That was the first use of the SWAT team. And, you know, we all know that story, which is LAPD literally shot out the Panther Party office, and uh, and the Panthers surrendered, you know, after a 4-hour shootout. But that is the beginnings of militarizing law enforcement, and the policies of the war on drugs gave it more fodder. The policies of the war on terror gave it more fodder. And now we're here. And this really, in this nightmare, I want to call it, moment where this administration continues to criminalize communities by any means necessary, and is growing how we even understand who's going to be criminalized. I think, as you know, Attorney General Jeff Sessions sits on the U.S.-Mexico border and declares literally a war on immigrants, on undocumented communities. We are witnessing the curation of a new generation of leaders of this country, really, not my leader, but the leaders of this country, that are hell-bent on breaking not just, you know, the backs of our communities, but breaking the spirits of our communities. And I think it's our job as organizers, as educators, as activists, as artists, to find new ways to stand up, to be bold and courageous in this moment, because it's going to be a long 4 years. It's already been a long 130 days. Um, and gathering in these ways, having these types of conversations, being more honest about how helpless we feel, but also reminding ourselves that there's so much hope. I find hope in the fact that we just, had a victory in Jackson, Mississippi with Antar Chokwe Lumumba, who just became the mayor there. It's a huge victory. And we should see the victories of our movement as victories for all of us, right? I think it's huge that locally an organization that I helped start, Dignity and Power Now, was able to win civilian oversight of one of the largest sheriff's departments of the world, and is challenging one of the largest jailers of the world. The local work is inspiring. And as much as the nightmare feels scary, there's so many incredible, regular ass human beings that are changing the fabric of this country.
Thank you. Um, so we often hear the phrase over-policed and underprotected. And we've spoken a lot about the over-policed portion of that equation. How do we get to the underprotected portion? What are ways in which you can imagine alternate systems developed to support and protect communities of color and other marginalized communities?
I mean, I'm just, sharing what I think is out there, and there's probably way more out there that I don't even know about. But I think, the Panthers were amazing. They had such amazing visionaries. We hear a lot about their work as, being brothers and sisters with guns. But that was, one piece of a much larger piece. I mean, they had this whole slogan, survival until revolution, in which they fed young black kids breakfast, in which they had sickle cell clinics, a disease that's largely impacts black Americans in particular. They created whole infrastructures and whole spaces that were about caring for our communities. And so I think it is really our duty to do the same. There's been amazing work across the country, folks creating health and wellness clinics where they bring together alternative healers and traditional healers for a few hours out of the month, and they, invite the community, come take care of yourself, come get healed in public, right? I think there's some amazing examples of folks who are doing transformative justice and community accountability work where, the slogan, no one deserves to be thrown away. And so instead of, reproducing the harm and punishment that this culture has taught us, that we are really digging in new ways to hold people accountable and hold ourselves accountable. Because the reality is the revolution may happen or may not in our lifetimes, but then what? Then what? You could topple over a building, but you have to build something else. You can challenge a law, you can get rid of it, but something else has to come into place. And so why not practice this right now? Why not practice the world we want to live in right in this current moment?
Oh, thank you for that. And that actually touches on the last question I want to ask you, which is how are people responding to this militarization, and how can those other community members who may not be involved yet, how can they contribute and get involved?
Yeah, I mean, some of the first big protests that I attended were anti-war protests during the Bush regime. And I remember, those powerful slogans that helped me understand and clarify, no wars abroad, no wars at home, and helped me clarify or understand the connection between the U.S. military budget and the domestic military. I mean, that's what it is. Law enforcement is domestic military, and that budget. I think part of the work is showing up in the streets, organizing and strategizing. But the other part of the work is connecting the dots, spending the time to study about what is actually happening. I remember when I learned about the SWAT team. I learned about the SWAT team because they raided my home. But it wasn't until I was older and joined the movement where I was like, well, where did this thing actually come from? Police they haven't always existed. Prisons haven't always existed. So what is the root? Um, and I would learn that, early days of policing they were really vigilantes, uh, and they became deputized, right? The early days of sheriffs were the first border patrols. And the early days of police were slave catchers, right? And this became a really important, that became clarifying for me. This isn't about bad apples. If that were the case, we would be able to clear up law enforcement agencies a long time ago. This is about a culture and a history of violence, and glorified, what did he call it? Righteous violence. That sounds like Klansman's language to me. And those connections are actually really important as we do this work, because what happens when we don't make those connections is we do things like, well, if we just had more body cameras, if they just were trained better. Well, we watched a video of a training. That's actually how they're being trained. And so the question has to become, can we imagine living in a world without police? Can we imagine living in a world without prisons? Do we even dare ourselves to imagine? Our imagination is not going to stop it today, but will we allow ourselves to imagine something differently? And I think that's what excites me. The access to our imagination, that for me, our imagination is the first place that they take away. They take that away first. And so we have to reclaim it. And that's what I think this moment is it's a reclamation of our imagination, because someone imagined handcuffs, they imagined a prison cell. And enough of us imagined it, and it became so. So we have to allow ourselves to decide, what else are we gonna imagine? Can we imagine more green space? Can we imagine our communities having access to healthy food? Can we imagine our communities having universal health care? These are things that in other places are common sense. But in this place, it's not. And so I'm an artist first. Organizing is just a form of art to me. And in my art, I'm always imagining a new world for my family, for my communities, and hopefully for all of us.
Yeah, that was beautifully put. Want to now open it up to the audience for questions from the audience? Gentlemen.
Okay, in response to all of this, what can I do? What can I do in direct response to this militarization that's going on?
You can join an organization. No one person can do anything. I just don't believe that. I think joining movements, joining organizations, there's plenty, from the Youth Justice Coalition to the American Civil Liberties Union to Dignity and Power Now to Black Lives Matter. There's a host of organizations. LA Can is doing amazing work in Skid Row. And so there's a significant amount of organizations in this city that are working on this policing issue in particular. When we challenge criminalization, we're challenging militarization. Um, it's all connected, and so my work. Some people, they're like, actually, environmental justice is where I need to be. That's like primary. That's my work. For me, criminalization. That's my work. That's what I believe is our. If we can get this part right, I think we'll be able to see the survival of our planet. If we can't, I think we're doomed.
Other questions?
This isn't actually a question, but I think that education is really important. And I think that because the white communities just really don't understand, they don't get it, they haven't experienced it, they don't know, or they don't want to know. Um, and I think that this is really great that this is on the west side. And these kinds of forums need to happen more in other communities so that people can be educated and they can participate and they can unite and join in this effort. Um, so I'm really happy that you're here. And this is what needs to happen, I think, more coming outside of your community to have this conversation, you know. Otherwise, uh, you know, you can't do it all by yourself, and we need to participate and do what we can to help. But people need to, they need to know what's really going on. I think a lot of people pull the covers over their heads, right?
Thank you. I know it wasn't a question, but do you have any thing to add regarding education?
No, I think you're absolutely right.
Back there.
I think thinking about the anti-war movement among so many other things right now is really difficult. Um, is there like a time when sort of that conversation you think started to phase out? Like, so it's not something we think about. We are waging war right now, and it's a conversation that can be. It's at an intersection with many things, but no one. I certainly haven't talked about a specific sort of anti-war movement recently.
Yeah, I mean, I think um, the unfortunate reality is different issues become popular in different moments. Um, I think I'm in circles where a lot of people are talking about anti-war. It's just not a popular conversation. I think the way it was during the Bush regime, but it doesn't mean that we stop talking about it. And I think we have to make those connections. I know that there was at least in the sort of, you know, work that I was doing during the anti-war movement, there wasn't the best race analysis, and so I think a lot of people have created better conversations and a better analysis around how to talk about the war at home and the war abroad. Um, the Movement for Black Lives just put out a policy statement a few months ago, and then a part of the policy statement talks about the war abroad and the war abroad and the war at home, and it goes into like a significant amount of demands specifically for the U.S. government and local government around how to do that. And so I don't think the conversation has ended. I just think there's moments where things are popular and when they're not. But I would say in all of our circles, we should be talking about the intersections of war and what that actually looks like.
Someone over there.
Please wait for the mic.
Thank you for coming, first of all. But mainly, what do you see as the biggest challenge for Black Lives Matter or other social justice movements at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like many of our movements are joining together. The biggest challenge, I think it's a challenge for all of us, which is how do you keep up with um, the amount of, you know, tearing away at civil liberties and civil rights and human rights by this administration. It's a lot to keep up with. I think I've read like this is the most unprecedented amount of executive orders from any president, and they're just not like, you know, kind of terrible executive orders. They're really, really terrible executive orders. And thankfully, for some of them, judges have intervened, thankfully. But for some of them, we don't have that because, especially around the environment, we don't have enough protections for the planet. So corporations become the intermediary, and that's deeply concerning. And concerned that we have a president and an administration that doesn't believe in climate change. And so I think our biggest obstacles right now is like, how do we have a strong enough strategy to make sure that we can protect everybody? And frankly, we don't, right? We're having, like I said earlier, there are some victories for sure. There's more than some, there's a lot of victories, but there's a lot of losses. I can count on my hand how many of folks that I know that are in our movement that have been deported or detained right now, or have received deportation notices. We don't have a system to protect people, and that makes me feel extremely vulnerable. It makes me think. It really makes me think about slavery and how people created the Underground Railroad, because we're in a moment where literally people can be snatched out of their homes in the middle of the night, at work. People who, this administration said it was only going to go after people with criminal records that were undocumented. It's a bold-faced lie. And so we don't have enough power to defend everyone that deserves to be defended.
I think let's go. You're the young person right there. Or yes, you.
With the hoodie.
Yes.
Right here.
Since you touched on slavery and then you also spoke of Klan language, that kind of inspired me to say two things that have been tumbling in my mind since I saw the film. So the first thing I'd like to touch on was the young man with the lawn business, and he had his $876 snatched. There was a small reaction I heard of people as they saw that, but the reaction seemed much bigger with the more, I guess, totalitarian aspect of the predictive policing and things like that. So just maybe in honor of his story, I'd like people to remember that really, for many communities, and it may be hard to get a sense of the scale of it because we're in LA, I'm from New York, if you're from a major metropolis, but a young black man starting a business with only $1,000 can be done there in the Carolinas right now, today. And that is the difference between his economic enslavement and his economic freedom. So we spoke of the new Jim Crow. The book is just as well as the concept. So I think we would all do well to just remember that the big concepts are there, and we're here to discuss them, but a lot of people's lives are a little bit closer to the bone than that. And it's important to remember that their struggle is right there at $876, which he'll probably have to go to court to get back, but he may not have the money to get it. And then the weed charge. So as you said, this is systemic. Small things chip away at the spirit, at people's freedom. Okay, but then the second thing, I did want to talk about the predictive policing. When officers are chosen, as well as military personnel, they do undergo personality tests. And if it wasn't apparent to people in the audience, then I just wanted to say that, how to put this? If you really look, you can see that they choose only one type. And that's pretty much kind of a passive-aggressive personality, heavier on the passive, and very easily led. And then you have a Mr. Grossman who has sort of a tent revival type approach to his training regimen and making true believers out of whatever he wants to tell them, using sex as a link to violence, which not only is unprofessional, but I mean, we could go on. So I mean, everyone is chosen specifically for their personality traits, and people, as far as what we call law enforcement, what we call military personnel, are chosen for certain personality traits, and more to the point, other people who are dissenters are systematically weeded out. So if we are to be responsible in that, since the gentleman who was talking about, predicting a murderer from birth, well, perhaps we should start looking at how police personality profiles affect us and how they're chosen, and we should hold them accountable and put them through the same, the same tests. And then perhaps when we do have dissenters, then we can get out of that bad apple, as you said, falsehood that they've been perpetuating, and see what's really systemic, and then there could be true change.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything?
No, I don't need to.
Yeah, that was wonderful. And I think
I do have a concern and wanted to know your perspective on corporizing prisons in California and Southern California. Like, for example, Lancaster. They're building prisons before they're even built. And it goes back to what you mentioned about. So I just wanted to know what's going on about that.
Yeah. There's a lot of groups. There's one group in particular here, CURB, Californians United for a Responsible Budget, who are fighting prison expansion and prison construction. It's really important, actually, to have the conversation about what gets constructed and what gets built. When a prison is prioritized over an educational facility, and not just the building, but the funding for that building, right? Locally, the LA County Board of Supervisors had just approved to build a $3.5 billion jail. This is about what we're prioritizing, right? And so there are active fights. If that's if that's something that you feel invested in, I would say please join CURB. There are active groups fighting locally to stop prison expansion. We've been able to win on some fronts and lose on others. But the more people who join, obviously I recruit people into the movement. It's the point of showing up to these things. Not to really talk so much, but to be like, all right, you interested, let's roll. But I think the work of stopping prison expansion is like not sexy. It's not fun. It's often following budgets. It's often stalking budgets because they get sneaky, because they say this is not a expansion. This is just a rebuilding. We're just gonna be the same amount of beds. But then you look, you're like, actually, no, it's not. Well, why do you have to even rebuild? Just tear it down, right? We don't actually need this. Let's repurpose. So that's like the short answer, and I just agree with you. But know that in the state of California, people are being hella vigilant about it.
so. I think we have time for just one more question, and I know that. I think though that this woman here has had her hand up for a while, so.
This is all very upsetting, the whole thing. And it's been upsetting for many years. And I can never totally understand. But I've lived in LA for 47 years. And when I first came here, there was an Asian lady and her 2 young children who were mowed down in a crosswalk under Daryl Gates. And it was the high-speed police chases. And of course, I wrote the letter. And there are things that people could do. You could stop and bear witness wherever you are. You could get out of the car and you could watch what the police are doing. This young boy down here, we need to protect him. Sorry to put you on the spot, dear. But we all need to care about one another and these kids and what's happening to our minority communities. And I'm sorry, but police are thugs. There are certainly They are thugs. They are outright motherfucker thugs. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry because it is the truth. I'm sorry. When I saw those guys there, I mean, we had the North Hollywood shootout, and I never forget the asshole in the blue shorts with the red hair who kicked the guy on the ground and he bled out. So, okay, we paid $3.5 million later, but Charlie Beck needs to go. And that's something we could all do here in LA. We need to be at those police commission meetings. And this business of Eric Garcetti and putting a smile on his face, well, fuck you. Fuck you. I mean, get the fuck out in the street and do your fucking job. And the other thing is, I'm sorry, but boy, I watched that film, and everybody should see that film. The other thing is, I hear people would say about how great Obama was. Well, he's not so goddamn great to the people he's dropping drones and bombs on. And it's like, what happened to this business about we're supposed to grow up and believe that people are our sisters and brothers? Well, we need to take a lot more action. And the other thing I wanted to say about bearing witness, it's like I was in Studio City, and these police were sitting there, and they're getting the young kids to come up to the table. And, you know, good on being police day, you know, kind of thing. And there had just been 2 mentally ill people killed within the last 2 days. And I asked those police, I said, well, what do you think of that? What do you think about the fact that a mentally ill woman comes up to you, and she's got a knife in her hand, she's 6 feet away, and she gets mowed down? And the response was thuggery. And I mean, I asked nice, that's not the point. But the point is, and then there was an old guy there, and I don't mean old as an old guy, but an older man. And he says, we ought to just kill them. We ought to just kill them all. And that's what we have in the LAPD. We have to get rid of. Anyway, I really appreciate you being here. And I want to just rededicate myself to whatever we can do here. Thank you both.
Thank you. Do you have any last things you want to add or to that? Or?
Thank y'all so much for showing up on this Thursday evening, right? That's the day?
Yes.
I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me, and I'm grateful that we were able to have this conversation. I hope that it doesn't stop here and doesn't end here.
Yeah. And thank you again to Patrisse and to the Hammer for putting on this event.